On February 19, 1945, 19-year-old Private First Class Jack Lummis waded through the surf toward the black volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima. He could see Mount Suribachi looming ahead, a 550-foot volcanic cone dominating the island. The beach seemed quiet. Maybe the pre-invasion bombardment had worked. Maybe the Japanese were all dead. Then Lummis's foot hit the beach. And all hell broke loose. Japanese artillery and machine guns that had been silent during the bombardment suddenly opened fire. Marines fell by the hundreds. The volcanic ash they were trying to cross was so soft that vehicles couldn't move. Tanks bogged down. Landing craft piled up on the beaches. And still more waves of Marines kept coming, landing into a meat grinder of Japanese fire. By the end of that first day, over 2,400 Americans were casualties. And the battle had just begun. This is the story of Iwo Jima. 36 days of the most brutal close-quarters fighting in Marine Corps history. A tiny volcanic island 8 square miles total that cost nearly 7,000 American lives and left another 20,000 wounded. An island where all but 216 of the 21,000 Japanese defenders fought to the death rather than surrender. The battle that produced the most famous photograph of World War II. And the battle that convinced American leaders that invading Japan itself would be unthinkably costly. Iwo Jima sits 760 miles south of Tokyo, roughly halfway between Japan and the Mariana Islands where American B-29 Superfortress bombers were based. The island is shaped like a trapezoid, just 5 miles long and 2.5 miles at its widest point. 8 square miles of black volcanic ash and rock. Before the war, about 1,000 Japanese civilians lived there, farming sugarcane and sulfur mining. But by 1945, the island had been transformed into a fortress. The Americans wanted Iwo Jima for several reasons. Japanese fighters based on the island's 2 airfields intercepted American B-29 bombers flying from the Marianas to bomb Japan. If the Americans controlled Iwo Jima, those fighters would be grounded. More importantly, Iwo Jima could serve as an emergency landing site for damaged bombers returning from raids. And American fighters based on Iwo Jima could escort the bombers all the way to Japan and back. The island was small but strategically vital. The Japanese knew the Americans would come eventually. Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kurabayashi was sent to command Iwo Jima's defense in June 1944. Kurabayashi was 53 years old, a veteran officer who'd studied at Harvard and traveled across America before the war. He understood American military power better than most Japanese commanders. And he knew Iwo Jima couldn't be held indefinitely. But he could make the Americans pay dearly for it. Kurabayashi broke with Japanese military doctrine. Traditional Japanese defensive tactics emphasized defending the beaches, stopping the invaders at the waterline. Kurabayashi knew this wouldn't work against American naval and air superiority. Instead, he pulled his forces inland and ordered his men to dig. For 8 months, Japanese soldiers and Korean laborers carved an underground fortress into Iwo Jima's volcanic rock. They dug 11 miles of tunnels connecting over 1,500 underground rooms. Artillery positions, command posts, barracks, hospitals, all underground where American bombs and shells couldn't reach them. Pillboxes and bunkers were built with reinforced concrete and camouflaged so thoroughly that Marines could walk past them without seeing them until guns opened fire. Every cave entrance had multiple exits. Every defensive position had fallback positions. The entire island became one interconnected fortress. Kurabayashi told his men they would all die on Iwo Jima. There would be no relief, no evacuation, no surrender. But each man should resolve to kill 10 Americans before dying. If every defender killed 10 Americans, the casualties would be so horrific that America might reconsider invading Japan itself. The defense of Iwo Jima was a calculated sacrifice intended to save the Japanese home islands. American planners expected the battle to last about 5 days. They were spectacularly wrong. The pre-invasion bombardment, which lasted 3 days, appeared to devastate the island. Thousands of shells and bombs fell on Iwo Jima. But most Japanese positions were underground, undamaged. When the Marines landed on the morning of February 19th, they walked into a trap. 70,000 Marines from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions hit the beaches. The first waves landed unopposed. The Japanese held their fire, waiting for more Americans to come ashore. When the beaches were packed with men and equipment, Kurabayashi gave the order. Every gun opened fire simultaneously. Marines caught in the open were cut down. The volcanic ash made movement almost impossible. Men sank to their ankles with each step. Tanks and vehicles bogged down completely. Within hours, the beaches were choked with destroyed equipment and casualties. But the Marines kept coming. Wave after wave landed, pushing inland despite terrible losses. By nightfall, 30,000 Marines were ashore, holding a beachhead barely 700 yards deep at its furthest point. And they'd paid 2,400 casualties for it. The next day, Marines attacked Mount Suribachi at the island's southern tip. The Japanese defenders fought from caves and bunkers honeycombing the mountain. Marines had to assault each position individually, often using flamethrowers and explosives to clear them. Progress was measured in yards. Every yard cost lives. On February 23rd, the fourth day of battle, a 40-man patrol from E Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, fought to the summit of Suribachi. Lieutenant Harold Schreier led the patrol. They reached the top around 10:30 a.m. and raised a small American flag on a length of pipe. Marines across the island and sailors offshore cheered when they saw the flag. Ship horns blared. For a moment, it felt like victory. But the flag was small, barely visible from parts of the island. Colonel Chandler Johnson, commanding the 2nd Battalion, wanted a larger flag, one that everyone could see. A second patrol was sent up with a bigger flag, measuring 96 by 56 inches. 6 Marines, Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, Private First Class Franklin Sousley, Private First Class Renee Gagnon, Private First Class Ira Hayes, and Navy Corpsman John Bradley, raised the second flag. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal was climbing Suribachi and arrived just as the second flag was being raised. He almost missed the shot, turning to check with Marine cameraman Bill Janost that he wasn't in the way. Janost's question made Rosenthal spin back around. He raised his camera and snapped one photograph as the 6 men pushed the flagpole upright. The photograph won the Pulitzer Prize and became the most famous image of World War II. 3 of the 6 flag raisers died before Iwo Jima was secured. Strank was killed by a Japanese artillery shell on March 1st. Block died from wounds received in the same attack. Sousley was killed by Japanese machine gun fire on March 21st. They never knew their photograph would make them immortal. But taking Suribachi didn't mean Iwo Jima was won. The mountain was just the southern tip of the island. The bulk of Kurabayashi's forces were dug in across the northern plateau. And that's where the real hell began. The terrain in northern Iwo Jima was a nightmare. Volcanic rock formed natural ridges and ravines that created perfect defensive positions. The Japanese had reinforced these natural defenses with concrete bunkers and interconnected tunnels. Marines advanced into what they called the meat grinder, an area containing 3 heavily fortified positions. Hill 382. The Amphitheater. Turkey Knob. Each had to be taken through direct assault. The fighting was the most brutal of the Pacific War. Marines attacked bunkers with flamethrowers and demolition charges. Japanese defenders fought from hidden positions, appearing suddenly to attack, then disappearing into tunnels. Progress was measured in feet. Days of fighting might gain 100 yards. Entire companies were decimated. Casualties mounted relentlessly. Marines developed new tactics out of necessity. Combined arms teams formed around tanks and flamethrowers. Riflemen provided cover while demolition experts planted explosives. Flamethrower operators burned out cave positions while tanks provided fire support. It was slow, dangerous work. Every position had to be cleared multiple times because Japanese soldiers would emerge from tunnels after Americans had moved past. The weather turned bad. Rain fell, turning the volcanic ash to mud. Visibility dropped. The cold at night contrasted with daytime heat. Water was scarce. Resupply was difficult. The smell of death was everywhere. Bodies, American and Japanese, lay unburied. The stench became so overwhelming that Marines tied cloth over their faces. Medical care was heroic but often futile. Navy corpsmen risked their lives repeatedly to treat wounded Marines under fire. But the severity of wounds and lack of blood plasma meant many men died despite the best efforts to save them. The casualty rates among corpsmen were horrific. They were targeted by Japanese snipers who knew killing the medic meant wounded Marines would die too. Jack Lummis, the young Marine who'd landed on D-Day, fought for over a month. On March 8, Lummis led his platoon in an attack on a Japanese strongpoint. He personally destroyed 2 enemy positions. Then he stepped on a landmine. The explosion severed both his legs. As corpsmen carried him away, Lummis kept encouraging his men. "Get them for me." As he was evacuated, he turned to the battalion commander and said, "I guess the New York Giants lost a pretty good end." Lummis had played professional football before the war. He died later that day. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, more than any other battle in American history. 14 were awarded posthumously. The recipients included Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, a hero of Guadalcanal who'd returned to combat and died leading his machine gun platoon on D-Day. Private First Class Jacqueline Lucas, just 17 years old, who threw himself on 2 grenades to save his squadmates. Corporal Tony Stein, who made multiple trips under fire to evacuate wounded. Private George Phillips, who sealed a cave full of Japanese with his own body after being mortally wounded. These medals represent only a fraction of the heroism displayed on Iwo Jima. Thousands of individual acts of courage went unrecorded. Men who should have received medals were killed before anyone could write up their actions. The everyday heroism of Marines fighting through hell became routine. Japanese resistance remained fierce to the very end. Kurabayashi had ordered no banzai charges, no wasteful suicidal attacks. His men would fight from prepared positions, falling back through the tunnel system, making the Americans pay for every foot. But on March 25, with most of the island lost, about 300 Japanese mounted a final desperate attack. They hit the command post of the 5th Marine Division's Pioneers and the Army's 147th Infantry Regiment. Over 100 Americans were killed or wounded before the attack was stopped. On March 26, 36 days after the landing, Iwo Jima was declared secured. But fighting continued. Japanese holdouts remained in the tunnel system. Some kept fighting for months. General Kurabayashi's body was never found. He probably died in the final days, but his fate remains unknown. The American casualties were staggering. Nearly 7,000 Marines killed. Over 19,000 wounded. 1/3 of all Marines committed to the battle became casualties. Some units lost 75% of their strength. The 4th Marine Division suffered over 9,000 casualties. The 3rd Marine Division over 6,500. The 5th Marine Division over 6,000. Naval personnel and Army units added hundreds more to the toll. Japanese losses were almost total. Of 21,000 defenders, only 216 were captured alive. The rest died. Many committed suicide rather than surrender. Others fought until killed. Some remained hidden in caves and tunnels, occasionally emerging to raid for food until starvation or American patrols finished them. The strategic value of Iwo Jima became controversial immediately. Over 2,200 B-29 bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima during the remainder of the war. Each bomber carried 10 to 12 crewmen. Defenders of the battle argue that thousands of airmen survived because Iwo Jima was available as an emergency landing site. If you saved one bomber crew, the argument goes, Iwo Jima was worth it. Critics point out that Japan's air defenses were already collapsing by February 1945. B-29s could have continued operating from the Marianas with acceptable losses. The fighters based on Iwo Jima added little to the bombing campaign. And the cost in Marine lives was astronomical. 7,000 dead for 8 square miles of volcanic rock. The horror of Iwo Jima influenced the decision to use atomic bombs on Japan. American planners estimated that invading Japan's home islands would cost 500,000 American casualties or more. If a tiny island like Iwo Jima cost 26,000 casualties, what would invading Kyushu or Honshu cost? The Japanese had shown at Iwo Jima and Okinawa that they would fight to the death. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, would be a bloodbath. When President Truman learned about the atomic bomb's successful test in July 1945, he saw an alternative to invasion. Drop the bombs, demonstrate their horrific power, convince Japan to surrender without invasion. The decision remains controversial. But the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa directly influenced it. The flag-raising photograph became an icon. Felix de Weldon, a sculptor, created a statue based on Rosenthal's image. The Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, dedicated in 1954, stands 78 feet tall. It honors all Marines who've died in combat since 1775. Every Marine who sees that memorial thinks of Iwo Jima. 3 of the flag raisers, Hayes, Gagnon, and Bradley, survived the war. They were brought home for a war bond tour, using their fame to raise money for the war effort. The tour was successful but difficult. Hayes, a Native American Pima Indian from Arizona, struggled with the attention and what he'd experienced. He developed alcoholism and died in 1955 at age 32, found dead of exposure and alcohol poisoning in an Arizona field. Gagnon lived until 1979. Bradley until 1994. Both men rarely spoke about Iwo Jima. Bradley's son wrote a book, Flags of Our Fathers, published in 2000, telling the story of the flag raisers. Director Clint Eastwood adapted it into a film in 2006. Eastwood also made a companion film, Letters from Iwo Jima, telling the battle from the Japanese perspective. In 2016, historians discovered that one of the men identified in the famous photograph had been misidentified for 71 years. The man thought to be John Bradley was actually Harold Schultz, another Marine from the same company. Schultz had never claimed to be in the photograph and died in 1995 without receiving recognition. The mistake was corrected after forensic analysis of all available photographs and film. Today, Iwo Jima, now called Iwo II, remains under Japanese control, though it's officially part of Tokyo. There's no civilian population. The island is a Japanese military base with restricted access. Once a year, survivors and families of those who fought there are allowed to visit for memorial ceremonies. The numbers dwindle each year as the last veterans pass away. The battlefields remain. The black volcanic beaches. The slopes of Mount Suribachi. The broken terrain of the northern plateau. Nature has reclaimed much of the island, but evidence of the battle persists. Rusted equipment. Collapsed bunkers. The terrain itself scarred by bombing and shelling. Walking those fields, it's impossible not to imagine what happened there. Iwo Jima remains the defining battle for the Marine Corps. It demonstrated everything Marines pride themselves on: courage, determination, sacrifice. But it also showed the cost of such values. 7,000 dead, 20,000 wounded, 1/3 of the force casualties. No other American battle in World War II cost so many Marines. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded Pacific operations, said of Iwo Jima, "Among the Americans who served on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue." It's the most famous quote about the battle. And it's true. Acts of extraordinary courage happened so frequently they became routine. Men did what had to be done, knowing it would likely kill them. They did it anyway. Private First Class Jack Lummis encouraged his men even as he was dying from horrific wounds. Gunnery Sergeant Basilone returned to combat after being decorated as a hero, knowing he'd likely die. Thousands of unnamed Marines charged Japanese positions under fire because that's what the mission required. They fought for their units, for their brothers beside them. Most never thought of themselves as heroes. They were just doing their jobs. 36 days of hell. That's what Iwo Jima was. Hell created by strategic necessity, Japanese determination, and American resolve. Hell that killed 7,000 Marines and 21,000 Japanese. Hell that produced the most famous photograph of World War II. Hell that convinced America's leaders that invading Japan would be unthinkably costly. Hell that defined the Marine Corps and remains seared into its institutional memory. Iwo Jima. 8 square miles of volcanic rock. 36 days in early 1945. And a memorial in Arlington, Virginia, where a flag is raised forever by 6 Marines frozen in bronze. 3 of them killed before the island was secured. All of them immortalized by one photograph taken in one instant on one hill on one island during the bloodiest battle the Marine Corps ever fought.